my father's a tough character, and he's relatively low in agreeableness, especially politeness, and although moderate in compassion. And he's a pretty harsh taskmaster, demanding in terms of his standards. And so he was difficult to please. And that's both a blessing and a curse, because the curse is that he's not pleased, but the blessing is that he thinks you can do better. And so, it's really hard to say when someone's on your side, it's not obvious exactly what that means. It's like, well, are they on the side of who you are, or are they on the side of who you could be? And a lot of what is necessary, paternal encouragement, I would say, speaking somewhat stereotypically, is being on the side of who you could be. And I thought this through quite carefully as a clinician, because one of the clinical psychologists who had a major impact, I would say, on me intellectually and practically was Carl Rogers. And Rogers preached, let's say, this doctrine of unconditional positive regard. And he's been criticized for that, because if you actually listen to Rogers, even in his interactions with clients, it was pretty obvious that his positive regard wasn't unconditional. And the problem with unconditional positive regard is, well, you're actually not okay the way you are. And who thinks they are? All of us are perfectly, if we have any sense, cognizant of our imperfections. We also hope we're not all we could be, because especially if you're suffering miserably because of your ignorance and your willful blindness and your malevolence, you think, God, I hope there's more to me than this. And you really do hope that. And then to have someone who's on the side of the part of you that could yet be better, that's really something. And I told my clients all the time when they came in for therapy, when I made such things explicit, that we were in a partnership to bolster the part of them that was aiming up, that was aiming at the good. And it was useful for people to partition themselves to some degree into that part that was aiming up and that could be trusted and relied upon as an aid to further growth, and that part that was, bitter and resentful and angry and sometimes homicidal and sometimes worse than homicidal, and that was clearly aiming down in every possible way. And I wanted to be on the side of the better angels of our nature, let's say. And I would say my father was definitely that. And so that was painful in some ways, because it was difficult to please him. And he applied the same standards to himself and paid a certain cost for that. But I did know fundamentally that he had my back, and I mean really fundamentally. And I knew that was not all that common, because many of my friends growing up, especially the group of friends I had before almost all of them dropped out of school, so that would have been junior high, they had very contentious relationships with their father that weren't predicated fundamentally on something like a mutual respect. And that was very hard on them, and I suspect also very hard on their fathers. And my father, when my friends used to come over, he cast a dim light on the bunch of juvenile delinquents that I hung around with in junior high, and perhaps for good reason. But they respected him, and they also knew that he was on my side. And so my father gave me an abiding, and then the other thing I should say about him is he spent a tremendous amount of time with me when I was very young, say before I was 5 or 6. He taught me to read. He did that every night for months, and I remember that very vividly, and instilled in me a love of books and a fluency in reading. He believed that I could do what I set my mind to. And he really believed that.
University is one of those patriarchal institutions that gives with one hand and takes away with another, right? So when you come here, there's thousands of you, there's tens of thousands of you. So in some sense, as an individual, you're rather faceless. And you're also, in some sense, at the bottom of the power hierarchy in the university. I think more than you should be, but whatever, you are at the bottom of it. And so there's a crushing institutional weight that comes along with being part of such a big university in particular, That's really hard on students in their first year. It's always seemed to me that it's better for first-year students to go to a smaller place where the institutional weight is not so heavy. And, I've tested U of T students in their first year with things like the Beck Depression Inventory, and about 30% of U of T students meet criteria for hospitalized depression. They do, but that's also because the Beck is way more sensitive to that than it should be, at least, because I don't think its criteria for when you should be hospitalized are reasonable. But the point is that the depression and the anxiety is quite high. And so, but on the other hand, of course, you're benefiting from going to university. And so that's the kind of bipolar nature of the symbol. It's the tyrant and it's benevolent tradition at the same time. You know, it's molding you. You could even say it's crushing you, because an educational system does that. But at the same time, it's like, well, unless you allow yourself to get crushed by it, you're not going to get the benefit. And that's the paradoxical relationship that individuals have with culture everywhere and at all time. You know, without culture, you're nothing. But with culture, you have to be a cog in some sense. And so the tension between those two things is continual and constant. You could think about it as an existential constant. Ever since there's been complex human societies, and maybe even when there were only tribal human societies, that's been a problem for the individual. So culture, tradition, the dominance hierarchy is a solution and a problem. And nature, the unknown, unexplored territory, is a solution and a problem. And then the third category, well, you see, I'll just tell you a couple of things about these images. So the one on the right, that's the devouring father that's also giving birth. So in some sense, your personalities are being devoured by the university, but at the same time, a new personality is coming, you know, emerging as a consequence of that, and hopefully it's a better personality than the previous one. If you can tolerate the tension of being transformed, the heat and the pressure, then hopefully you come out, you know, though it's worth it. The process is worth it. Okay. Now, you know, you see on the right at the top, you see a picture of an old man kissing Joseph Stalin, which is quite a weird thing to do, given that Joseph Stalin was probably responsible for the deaths of, you know, some number of people in excess of 10 million, perhaps in excess of 30 million. People argue about this all the time. He certainly starved 6 million Ukrainians to death in the 1930s, which is something that, you know, for some reason you don't hear much about in your education. But, you know, 6 million Ukrainians, probably worth noticing a little bit. But it doesn't matter, because this old man, this was taken after the fall of the Berlin Wall. He's nostalgic for the times when everything was certain, you know, and the gold statue of Stalin is a representation, in some sense, of a deified leader. And the old man is there as in a position of worship. And then Captain Hook there at the bottom on the right-hand side, he's quite an interesting character, because he's basically a tyrant. And the Peter Pan story is very interesting, because Peter Pan sort of means everything. And Peter Pan is the sort of person who wants to retain the dynamic potential of childhood. Because when you're a child, you're not anything, but you could be anything. So you're pretty much only potential. And then you might say, well, why should you sacrifice that potential to become something actual? Because in some sense, it's actually a limiting process. So for example, and I mean this in the most concrete possible way, you have more neural connections when you're born than you do at any other time in your life. And most of those die by the time you're 2. So you go through this tremendous pruning process from when you're born till 2. So it's like you're dying into your childhood personality. And then again, the same thing happens at the end of adolescence between, say, 16 and 20, which is also the peak time for risk for the emergence of schizophrenia, and some people think that's the pruning process gone wrong. But, you know, as an adolescent, you also shed childhood potential to become the limited but specialized and potentially useful thing that you will become. And so you might say, well, is it worth it? Is it worth shedding that potential? And Peter Pan's answer to that is, well, no. He wants to remain in Neverland as a magical boy forever. And he's king of the lost boys, which I would say is that's not much of a dominance hierarchy, right? It's like you're the king of the losers, so to speak, people who can't get their act together and mature. You notice in Peter Pan that Peter Pan doesn't grow up. He doesn't establish a relationship with Wendy, who's actually real. He has to settle for Tinkerbell, who, you know, is a fairy, and they don't exist. And so she's really, in some sense, a figure of his imagination, because he won't mature. He can't have an actual relationship with a genuine person. So he has to satisfy himself with, well, it's something like a pornographic fantasy, actually. So seriously, it is like that. I mean, it's toned down a lot in the movie version, obviously, but still, that's what's underlying it. Now, you might say, well, why doesn't Peter Pan want to grow up? And the answer is, the only figure of authority that's around for him is Captain Hook. And he doesn't like Captain Hook, and that's because Captain Hook is a tyrant. He's brutal. you know, and he's also a coward because he's lost a hand already to a crocodile with a clock in its stomach. That's chaos and time. You know, that's the dragon that lives underneath everything. It's like the basilisk in Harry Potter. And that damn crocodile's already got a piece of him, which is exactly the case. Like that crocodile's got a piece of me. You know, I'm older than 50, and so time has already got its grip on me. And you know, part of the problem of being adult is that you also have to take the fact that you're finite and limited into account. And if you're terrified by that, which people tend to be, then it can easily turn you into a tyrant. Because you're afraid of everything or disgusted by everything, and you have to ramp up the amount you control it. And so Peter Pan looks at Captain Hook and he thinks, there's no damn way that's what I want to end up as. So he's got a bad role model. You know, so Captain Hook and Stalin and this sort of devouring monster are good representations of the negative or tyrannical element of the Great Father. So that's the tyrannical element of the dominance hierarchy.